Hey everyone, it's Austin in the middle. So recently I decided to deep dive back into a show that at one point was my favorite show on television until it stopped being my favorite show on television. And I just want to talk about Arrow. And I'm going to start off with season one. Arrow was a show when it came out, I think, in 2012. This was in like the golden age of comic book adaptation television shows. I mean, you had the influx of shows like The Walking Dead coming out, and then, Preacher came out not too long after that. And then, of course, CW started the superhero trend after Smallville wrapped up its final season by birthing this show, Arrow. Now, Arrow was actually created by the same team that made the god awful Green Lantern movie from 2009. And it's kind of perplexing to me how that idea in the movie they had for Green Lantern was supposed to start the original DCEU, but it failed at the box office, so they had to reprioritize who was behind the vision and all of that, and that led to Zack Snyder and everybody involved with those subsequent movies that still have a rabid fan base today. It's kind of shocking to me that the people behind Green Lantern made Arrow. And I know Arrow has a lot of controversial takes out there in the fandom, especially within what is now known as the Arrowverse fandom, where people still to this day will argue that Arrow is a divisive show inherently because it doesn't really honor the source material that well. And for the most part, it was pretty much the producer's way of making a Batman show without using Batman. And I can kind of see that, but I'm going to be upfront here. I still think that this show was needed at the time it came out. And I dare say that I think that this show's version of Oliver, for me personally, is my favorite iteration of Green Arrow. And I've read plenty of Green Arrow comics because the show got me into the comics. I'm not going to say that I was reading Green Arrow before the show came out or anything because that would be a lie, but I remember when the show came out, I had to start reading Green Arrow somewhere. So I heard from recommendations. People said to go read Green Arrow Year One, go read some of the Brightest Day tie-in stuff, maybe read some of the Kevin Smith stuff, and then New 52 was brand new at the time, and I was reading New 52 Green Arrow, and still to this day, as far as comic book series goes, New 52 is probably my favorite run for Green Arrow ever, aside from the stuff that Andy Diggle was doing with like Green Arrow Year One, for example. And I don't know if that's a hot take or not, but that's just my opinion. And I feel like this show feels the most like those two series that I'm more of a fan of for the character of Oliver Queen, who happens to be the main character of Arrow. So yeah, the producers behind this show when they started Arrow, I don't know if they knew where they wanted to go with this first season, but I do know that there's a lot of great shit in this season, and I feel like I should start talking about it. So, season one here is 23 episodes, like the remainder of every season of the show, minus the final season, which is only 10 episodes, which is more so kind of tie in episodes to a crossover they were doing by that point in the Arrowverse, but we'll get into that much later in this review series of Arrow season reviews. This first season, I think, is a great jumping off point for the show to build on. I mean, there's so many characters introduced here. Um, there's significant characters that are in this first season that ended up actually dying in the series canon, which is shocking for a long running show like this. You wouldn't think that an 8 season show would be willing to kill off its main cast at points, but this show is one of the few exceptions that you'll see in superhero television where they are not afraid to kill off main cast members. But nine times out of 10 is due to actors leaving due to other projects they're committing to, or they literally just want out of the show, so they ask the writers to kill them off. And sometimes certain characters get killed off despite the actors not wanting that to happen, and it's literally a creative choice that was probably the wrong decision. which I can obviously say here, I don't mean any disrespect to Greg Berlanti, Mark Guggenheim, and fellow other producers behind the Arrowverse. At least when when I'm talking about like, seasons 1 through 3 of Arrow and maybe seasons 1 through 4 of Flash. I will say, yeah, we haven't gotten to Arrow season 4, but Arrow season 4 is a really rough season in this show, and we'll get there when we get there. But early on, I can remember when this show came out, this was like a really buzzed about show. It was almost talked about as much in, comic book shops as the Walking Dead TV show. And I remember my comic shop owner telling me that Walking Dead comics were easily the highest selling comics at that point. And then when the Arrow show came out, they were selling out of literally anything Green Arrow they had in the back issue bin. They were literally like the Mike Grell stuff, even that they had on the wall, was selling out. New 52, they cannot keep New 52 Green Arrow on the shelves. And still to this day, when I go talk to this comic shop owner about series in recent years they remember was just like unkeepable on the shelves, New 52 Green Arrow was one. It was so popular, in fact, that it was one of the series that you can buy on newsstands at a certain point, even when newsstands were kind of obsolete in the comic market. I remember seeing Green Arrow comics in Barnes and Noble for the longest time. So it wasn't like nobody can get their hands on Green Arrow content. And a lot of it has to deal with the show, I feel. But the show itself has a lot of merit to it. It's well made, it's well shot. It's probably one of the best choreographed, street level superhero shows I've ever seen, maybe next to Netflix's Daredevil and Luke Cage shows. And I know Daredevil, that original 3 season run on Netflix has a high reputation, but I would dare say that this season of Arrow, this first season, can go toe to toe with those 3 seasons of Daredevil in terms of writing. Now, I will say season 1 is not a perfect season. I mean, there's some bugaboos this time watching it for me that in hindsight, I feel like it really pigeonholed the show moving forward. And in terms of direction and in terms of where they could have taken certain characters, I feel like this season was kind of a waste with a few characters that we're going to talk about, which is really frustrating. But off the bat, this season, at least the pilot kicks you off basically with a retelling of Andy Diggle and Jock's Green Arrow Year One version of the character in the pilot episode. And that episode, and I guess Andy Diggle's Green Arrow Year One story is the foundation and the building block for this show in a nutshell. And I really appreciate that, coming into this, knowing that now and having read that run after seeing season 1 in its entirety. And mind you, the last time I've seen this season, y'all, it had to be on a rewatch on Netflix back in like 2013 or 14. So it's been 10 years. So I have a whole new fresh outlook on this show. I still think that that was a great direction choice to go with. And starting off the story showing Oliver on the island looking like a a bearded maniac in a Robin Hood costume definitely grasped the audience. And once he gets rescued and brought back to Starling City, which is the main city of the show, you'll get a sense that Oliver had this whole community of people that knew his name. He was kind of a celebrity in town. He had this rich, upscale, lavish lifestyle that he left behind for 5 years because, as we learn in the season, he was shipwrecked from his father's boat, the Queen's Gambit. And we learn also a tragic backstory about certain passengers, including his own father, in this season. And we get introduced to these flashbacks, even beginning in episode 1 in the pilot, that show you that Oliver went through a lot of shit until he got back to the current point in time. So this is a big fundamental thing that's going to be at least prevalent for the first 5 seasons until the flashbacks disappeared. Once the flashbacks get caught up to present day, there's no more need for them. And some people will still say that the flashbacks should have kept going past season 5, or if they weren't going to go past that point, the show should have ended there. And I can kind of agree, but I will say in the beginning of the show, it offers all the backstory and context that you need to know of how this billionaire playboy, panty dropper of a dude was able to become a lethal fighting machine and pretty much an expert marksman with a bow and arrow. And it's a fascinating backstory, and I think a lot of what makes season 1 so great is the balancing of Oliver coming back, him having this persona that he's developed over the past 5 years, partially due to his father's promise that Oliver tends to make, keep on. And part of that has to do with Oliver, I guess, taking on this hood persona, as he calls himself in season 1, as his way of survival for all those years. And he doesn't know anything else other than to be that. And he's forgotten how to be his former self, Oliver Queen. And in a lot of ways, he's written kind of like Bruce Wayne in this show, where he talks about himself in the third person a lot. And he refers to Oliver Queen as kind of like a character he plays, because almost every action he does in this first season, whether he comes back to save face with the media and pretty much announce to them that he doesn't plan on going to his father's business, Queens Consolidated, or whether he plans to announce that he's going to open up his own nightclub just for it to be a front to have an alibi in case law enforcement comes and possibly picks up the hint that he could be this vigilante character. He's running a business, and that's where his whereabouts are on the events where this hood decides to come after criminals of Starling City. Um, whether we're talking about any of that, he definitely treats his former, I guess, identity as something he wears, and I think he identifies more with this hood persona, which is a very intriguing angle for Green Arrow, since he's not really like that in the comics. That's more of a Bruce Wayne thing. And honestly, I don't have a problem with it, because I think it does offer an interesting dynamic between his character and the rest of the cast. And I think at least in this first season, you get a sense that um I guess on a metaphorical lens here, that the island has morphed his sense of reality and perception of himself. And I think that is a great way to start his character off moving forward in the show, because you do see his character evolve, and you do see pieces of the real Oliver come back over time. But it comes with sacrifices, and it comes with a lot of mistakes his character has to make to learn and grow from. And I think that's just genius writing. And I can't hold anything against this first season when it comes to Oliver. I think every direction they picked here was smart. And moving on from that, Oliver, he, as we learn in the flashbacks, he had an interaction with this gentleman named, I think is Lao Fei. And Lao Fei, I guess, is the original hood that is on this island called Lian Yu that Oliver has found himself on in the flashback sequences. And Lao Fei takes him under his wing and essentially has to give him some tough love and hard knocks after Oliver, of course, is pretty much interrogated by this, I guess, season 1 arcing villain in the series of flashbacks named Fires. And Fires is this, I guess, hired military covert ops guy who's been sent to this island to essentially, I guess, spy on the Chinese government and set up a weapon that can essentially cause terrorist attacks on Chinese airlines and put a stop to their economy, which is pretty hardcore for a show you see on syndicated television, especially with a superhero show. And the stuff that you see Oliver go through, I mean, he's getting interrogated, he's getting all these brutal scars and stabbings happening to his body that we see in present day, or wounds that he's healed from. And we get caught up with that on the context. We get caught up with the fact that he really looks up to this Lao Fei character. But in the flashbacks, we see that Lao Fei ends up getting compromised, and Oliver comes face to face with death many times and has to essentially luck out, given his expertise at that point of the story. And luckily for him, he's able to get a glimpse, or I guess a hint, of where he needs to go to find real sanctuary on the island. That leads him to the hands of Slade Wilson. And Slade Wilson, as you guys know if you read any DC comic, is Deathstroke. So we're implied to infer that this Slade Wilson version of the character here in the show at some point is going to become Deathstroke. And maybe we'll see, maybe as soon as season 2, what that means. But for now, Slade, he's like this mercenary that's crash landed on Lian Yu. Oh, I guess a while before Oliver got there, and his partner was compromised by this Fires guy who loves to take, I guess, new arrivals to the island and essentially either force them to join his mercenary movement, or if they just don't want to join, they get executed. And I guess Slade was a big problem, and was undetectable for so long that I guess they gave up looking for him. But nonetheless, Oliver ends up with Slade, and for majority of the season in the flashbacks, especially when we get to one of my personal favorite episodes, which is almost an entire episode dedicated to the flashbacks, with episode I think 17 or 14, The Odyssey. Maybe it's 14. The Odyssey has to be my favorite episode of the whole season because we see Oliver start to blossom from his, I guess, annoying persona that we saw in the flashbacks earlier in the show at that point. And then now he's graduating to learning how to fight with Slade, and Slade comes up with this plan with Oliver, and he needs Oliver to come through. And in this episode, we see Oliver come face to face with opportunity to, not only show Slade he's worthy enough to be a partner in this, I guess, plot to bomb the Panhandle, let's just say. What I mean by that is to overtake Fires and his mercenary group for being shitheads, and to also find a way off Lian Yu. We see Oliver have these multiple opportunities throughout the episode, but in the back of his mind, he still is holding on to this love that he has back home of Laurel, which is a whole rabbit hole for this season, as you'll come to see if you watch the season. But there's this whole thing where Oliver, on the day, or I guess in the preceding days that preceded him arriving on the island of Lian Yu, he had brought his then girlfriend's sister on this boat, the Queen's Gambit, with his father to go, I guess, on a journey to China before the ship crashed. And Sarah is thought to be dead from Oliver's point of view, from what he witnessed. So he's holding on to this guilt that he got his girlfriend's, or I guess ex-girlfriend's sister killed, and he was cheating on his ex-girlfriend with her own sister, and he's holding on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, if he gets to come home, he can hope to make it right. But you know that in this one particular scene during this mission with Slade, and he has the opportunity to use the phone, he calls Laurel, and she picks up on the other end, and he can't bring himself to say anything, which shows you that he's not ready to leave the island. And at that point, that's the point where I guess hindsight works best for the show, is that I can see that the writers knew how to characterize him in that moment and show you, the audience, that he's not ready to leave the island. There's a lot that he needs to learn and overcome to be emotionally ready to be able to take that on, which I think was brilliant writing. And without this episode in this season, I feel like a lot of that context and that believability would be missing for the remaining episodes of the show, sadly enough. But going back to the team dynamic, we've seen the flashbacks that Oliver loves to work as a team, either with Lao Fei or Slade, or even Lao Fei's daughter, Shadow, who is also in and out of the story in the flashbacks of season 1. She's more of a pivotal player in the next season, and maybe more so the later season episodes for this season, where she becomes an official, I guess, trio member of Oliver and Slade. But Shadow is pretty much the character that introduces him to archery, and she's a much needed character for his development as well. And he's used to working as a team. So when he comes back to Starling City, he has this bodyguard that we get to meet in the pilot episode that is essentially a little too good at his job, and his name is John Diggle. And not a lot of people know this, but John Diggle was not in the comics before Arrow's TV show. I think his first appearance was in a Arrow season 1 comic adaptation, but in reality, he wasn't in DC canon until New 52 Green Arrow, I think issue 24 or something, where I think even Ricardo Diaz made his first appearance, if I'm not mistaken. And he ended up being a season 6 villain. So that should tell you that, like I said, New 52 Green Arrow felt a lot at home with this Arrow TV show. But I love John Diggle. His actor is incredible. And Diggle is kind of like the voice of reason for Oliver. See, when Oliver first comes back to Starling City, he's more of like a assassin almost, where he's not afraid to kill, and he doesn't have his iconic look that he has, I guess, in season 3 onward, with your typical superhero eyewear, where it's obviously covering the eyes and all of that, and like a more official looking outfit. No, he's wearing this raggedy ass from the forest handmade Robin Hood get up, and he's using these bows that I guess he got from Lian Yu and maybe from Shadow, and he uses his green face paint on his eyes. um, so like Oliver, he is definitely molded by this island of Lian Yu, and he's not afraid to kill until Diggle is essentially recruited by Oliver to join him in his quest to inflict justice on this list that he has of his father's that was bequeathed to him. And on this list are people that his father insinuated to Oliver are people that failed the city. And he feels that Diggle, since he has a similar backstory dealing with one particular villain that we see a couple times in this season, known as Deadshot. If you're familiar with DC Comics or maybe Suicide Squad, Deadshot is a big mainstay in the Suicide Squad. So if you're familiar with that, he's a character in the show. And it's revealed that Deadshot killed Diggle's brother. And what gets Oliver on the side of Diggle at first, when he asked Diggle to join, even though Diggle didn't want to, and pretty much quit his job of being Oliver's bodyguard over it, was the fact that Oliver told him, hey, look, I killed Deadshot. That was me. And since we put into Deadshot, you can help people that have been victimized by these criminals, and you can help bring that justice that you were seeking for your brother. So that convinces Diggle to join, and Diggle's honestly probably the best side character in this whole show, until he's basically not in it anymore, sadly. But nonetheless, Diggle is a great addition. And then later on in the season, we get this side character that starts off. See, this is the part of the of the review that we're going to get into pretty much the whole thick of it here. There's a character named Walter who is Oliver's stepfather, and Walter used to work for Oliver's father at Queens Consolidated before Oliver's father, of course, passed away. And since in the year's time that he's been gone from Starling City, his mother Moira, Queen, has married this guy named Walter, and his stepdad pretty much runs Queens Consolidated. And Walter ends up going missing at, I think, around episode 9, which is the Christmas episode. And it has a lot to deal with Moira's own doing and her involvement with a certain character named Malcolm Merlin, which I'll get into shortly. But Walter, he when he's introduced in the story, Oliver doesn't really know what to do at first, but when he's taken out of the situation, this reminds him of this character that he's been interacting with that works at his family business named Felicity Smoke, who's played by Emily Bett Rickards, who is an absolute fox, I should say. And I know a lot of fans hate her later on in the show, especially about season 4. That's when people start tapping out with her character. I have to agree there, sadly, but these first seasons, she's more comedic relief and a side character. And then when Oliver recruits her as this hacker, she's able to be that character to do the more unbelievable things that Oliver shouldn't know how to realistically do. Even though we do get glimpses in the flashback of him tinkering with gadgetry and whatnot, we can't make Oliver a jack of all trades. He can't be some guy that lived on an island for 5 years but somehow learned how to hack, CIA corporations, FBI files, and stuff like that. That's just not something in his MO. Felicity's there to facilitate that, and for the most part in this season, she's pretty tolerable. Now, for the remaining cast, there's a lot of side characters. I mean, we have Thea Queen, who's Oliver's little sister. She has her own arc in this season where, she's a senior in high school. She's about to graduate, but right on her 18th birthday, she gets caught doing this drug known as, I think it's Vertigo, and Vertigo comes up a few times in this season. And but nonetheless, Thea wrecks her car on Vertigo. She gets arrested by this character named Detective Quentin Lance, and Quentin essentially throws the book at her, says she's going to have to go to court for this because she wrecked her car and she could have killed somebody. And of course, her family tries to pay to get her out of it, but unfortunately for Thea, it's not going to work this time because the judge doesn't want to let a rich girl get off for doing something this serious and wants to make an example out of her. But luckily for her, Oliver's ex-girlfriend Laurel Lance comes into play and offers to take Thea under her wing and have her work at Laurel's law firm, which happens to be in this part of the city called the Glades, which plays a humongous role in this season. But Thea, through that, is able to kind of learn, a harsh lesson in, punishment here, doing, I think, 100 hours community service or something like that through this job. But through this, she also meets her boyfriend that will play a later role in this season and in the next, named Roy Harper. Now, if you read the comics, Roy Harper is the original Speedy, and you also know that Roy Harper ends up becoming Arsenal in the show later on. He's introduced in this season, and Roy's a very intriguing character, and I think that really when he comes into the show, that's when Thea starts to become a genuinely good character. But there is moments here and there with Thea, having her moments with Oliver being like a brother that she thought was dead, and she's explaining to him that she just wants to be open with him and get to know him after all this time has gone by since she literally thought her brother was dead all this time. So she's trying to communicate to him that she wants an open relationship with him because she thought he was dead, and she wants to feel like he's still not dead in the presence of her, which I think was an intriguing angle at first, but they never really did anything with her character. I don't really feel like they knew what to do with her. Is she a rebellious teen, or is she going to be the romantic interest of another character or something? I know they were teasing that she had this crush on this other character who ends up being Oliver's best friend, Tommy Merlin, who plays a big role, I guess, in the drama of this season. His character was basically facilitating a lot of the relationship drama that we saw throughout it. But that's to be expected. They're testing the water with characters to, I guess, see fan reaction and ratings, where to move forward. This is a show on syndicated television after all. But as we know, Laurel, Oliver's ex-girlfriend, she kind of starts out with Oliver in a similar situation as Thea, but not as open-armed. She's very pissed off with Oliver and blames him for what happened to her sister, which is rightfully so. And the same thing with her father, Detective Quentin Lance. Both of them really hate Oliver, and Oliver has to kind of warm up on them over time. And before you know it, Oliver's made friends with them. Or more so Laurel, and Laurel's kind of learned to kind of forgive him for what happened. And Detective Lance over time learns to not be a thorn in his side, even though Detective Lance throughout many episodes of this season, I think I counted like 2 or 3. He's of course seeing the phenomenon of the hood going on and the connection and the parallels to Oliver Queen returning to Starling City, and there's even some evidence and some damning evidence at that that Oliver perhaps is in fact the Hood. And there's one particular episode, I think the first time we see this interaction with the two of them is like episode 5. Oliver's like willingly trying to take a lie detector test to prove to Laurel that he's not hiding anything. But in like the same episode, Detective Lance kind of sniffs some bullshit out. And it was like a running gag for, I guess, from that episode until around episode, I want to say 18, where there's this on again, off again thing with Oliver. He'll get, sussed out as the Hood, and he has to go on some wild, extravagant thing for the episode to kind of show that, you're not quite there on the pulse, but I'm going to give you something to forget about your suspicion of me, or I'm going to dress up Diggle as the Hood and give me an alibi. And he literally finds himself a way out of, getting found out a couple of times just because he has some hindsight into those things. But nonetheless, that's some, to be expected things with those characters. But going back to Tommy and Laurel, Tommy is Oliver's best friend, and Tommy, he's the son of Malcolm Merlyn, who ends up being the big bad of the season. Malcolm Merlyn plays the Dark Archer, and he has this plan called the Undertaking to essentially level the Glades in Starling City to avenge the death of his wife, who I guess founded a hospital in that part of the city to, I guess, help save the city. But the people turned on his family, and that drove Malcolm crazy. It drove him to go to Nandor Parbat, where obviously Ra's al Ghul lives, if you're not familiar with that location in DC lore. He was probably trained by the League of Assassins, um, and came back to Starling City with some newfound perspective and a newfound idea to present, as we learn later on, to fellow billionaires of Starling City that they essentially need to buy up as much real estate as possible in the Glades and shut down the subway system and everything so that way they can have the groundwork for technology that's going to be present around the time that the finale of the season takes place. Now, I should kind of mention that Malcolm Merlyn's plan goes back to, the prior events of the show, 5 years earlier, even before, Robert, who's Oliver's dad, decided to take the Queen's Gambit over to China. The whole idea for that was that Robert was going to go over to China to, I guess, meet with some business partners to get involved in the undertaking. Um, and in doing so, that's going to enable them to, I guess, buy more land in the Glades. But what ends up happening is Malcolm Merlyn snipped out the bullshit from Robert and possibly sabotaged the boat, which is the reason why it wrecked out in the middle of the North China Sea, as we'll learn. But, Malcolm was behind the sabotage of that. And Moira, who's Oliver's mom in the story, and we see throughout, is perhaps working these shady dealings at first with Malcolm and doing something very seedy, and we're kind of taught not to like her. Over time, it becomes more complex, and you feel sympathy for her because she's in between a rock and a hard place with this guy, because the guy had her husband killed essentially, and almost killed her son to put a stop to any potential adversary, or adversarious forces that can come out of it. And little did Merlyn know that Robert, on that ill-fated trip, had brought Oliver along with him and kind of fueled Oliver of what he needs to do for the next 5 years, because 5 years later, the technology that they were talking about in the previous events finally became available. And there's this whole thing with like Unidac Industries with Merlyn and how he acquires said technology and how the subways play a role and all of that. Fitter fodder, but nonetheless, that ends up being the main, I guess, bad of the season. And you think that Tommy Merlyn would play a bigger role in that, but majority of the season, Tommy, he goes through his own self-discovery. He's like a rich kid, and he never has had to have responsibility, but he has this crush on Laurel, who he's thought for years has been this untouchable woman, because he's always viewed her as Oliver's claim. But when Oliver comes back to Starling City and he sees that there's no shot in hell that Laura's going to want to get back with him, he kind of gets like the okay from Oliver at first to go after Laurel. And he does so and it succeeds. And him and Laurel start this romance that is very sweet. And I would say that I'm kind of sad that we didn't get to see their romance kind of flesh out a little bit better. But I guess for the time being in this season, the time we did get to see with Tommy and Laurel was a very wholesome romance. And there's certain moments in this season, especially with like episode 22, Darkness at the Edge of Town, which is my second favorite episode of the whole season. And honestly might be one of my top 10 episodes of the whole show. We see Tommy has completely evolved as a person, where he started out as this, rich kid. He's spoiled. He gets everything that he wants, but he's never had any sort of responsibility. His dad cuts him off of money. And this forces him to be real and honest with Laurel. And Laurel tells him to get a job. And he asks Oliver to be the manager of the nightclub. And he organizes what ends up becoming Club Verdant in this show to be, Oliver's nightclub alibi for his bunker underneath. He ends up building that from the ground up. There is some setbacks to it, like with episode 10 Burned, which is honestly one of my least favorite episodes of the whole season. But, you know, Tommy has to learn some, humility. He has to be humble. He has to know what it's like to have to work for money. And through that, he becomes a real person. And Laurel kind of falls for that. But we see over time, Oliver is still kind of in the way of their relationship from going any further. Like, he knows that him and Laurel can be together, but as long as Oliver's in the picture, Laurel's always going to have some sort of feeling for him. And Tommy low key knows that Laurel is really supposed to be with him. And Tommy's just like a placeholder in all of this. And like, like what you would expect in this episode 22, right before the finale, Tommy has to make a heart wrenching decision and break up with Laurel. But his own best friend tells him that, get her back, dude. Me and her can never work. But then, of course, we see Oliver and Laurel hook up, which is probably one of the biggest mistakes of this season, and I'll get into that shortly. But what happens to Tommy in this season is tragic. And it's really sad by the end of it because, spoiler alert, Tommy dies in the last episode. And I think that's probably the biggest mishandle out of all the characters in this season. That was probably the worst direction they possibly could have taken the show moving forward. They definitely wrote themselves in a corner with that whole situation with Tommy and all the potential they had given the finale and what we see happen with Malcolm Merlyn possibly being dead. There's a lot of Sam Raimi Spider-Man 3 potential to be had there that just wasn't capitalized on, and it's a tragedy. But Tommy is probably one of the better side characters in this season, and trust me, there's a lot to go over. Moving on from that, we've already talked about, Oliver's team dynamic, the flashback characters, Tommy, Laurel. There is a character I kind of brought up, like Sarah. She's more used as a plot device to drive a wedge between Oliver's past and his present, especially dealing with the Lances in the story. And there's this whole episode where Laurel's mom comes back into the fold in the season, and she's convinced that Sarah's alive, which might have some ramifications. And I guess this was kind of like the soft test to see if audiences would want to see a story with Sarah in the future. And spoiler alert, Sarah does come back. And if you're not familiar with the Arrowverse, you should know that Sarah Lance is a big character in a certain other Arrowverse show. So that should tell you that this is the show that introduces her. And what we learn later on with Sarah is very intriguing, but we'll get to that when we get to that. And I guess this is also the same season that we get to learn of Diggle's would-be wife later on, Lila. And she is, I guess, an ex-military person like Diggle who ends up running this organization called Argus, which ends up being kind of a more important organization in this show. And Lila has like maybe one or two episodes where we get to see her interacting with some villains. I think Deadshot comes back a few times and Lila's trying to go after him. And Diggle is kind of conflicted with his relationship with her because every time Deadshot's revealed to be alive again, Diggle gets reminded that this is why he joined Oliver's team. And if he can't put to bed that Deadshot is still alive, then he's never going to be satisfied. And that's also a very intriguing angle with Diggle and Oliver, is that Diggle tries to teach Oliver that killing maybe isn't the way to go, and also, just going off the father's list of, um, perpetrators isn't just the way to go. But when it comes to Deadshot, Diggle's willing to tell Oliver, "Hey man, I got to kill this guy." And Oliver, at that point of the show, he's starting to kind of question if he really wants to kill and if he wants to be known as this brutal archer. When there's another brutal archer, the Dark Archer, killing people too, he doesn't. He's taught through some mistakes that he doesn't want to be that. And a lot of the founding belief is actually not just from his relationship with Diggle. It's probably to, I think, the biggest wasted opportunity outside of Tommy Merlin in this season, which is Huntress, who is Helena Bertinelli. I think around episode 7 or 8, Helena's character is introduced, and there's this whole, like, I guess, multi-episode arc of her character. Like, I think it's episode 7, 8, and 17 that I guess wraps up Huntress in this whole fucking show, which pisses me off, because she should have been way more than what she ended up being in this show. But we see Helena's father being this like crime lord, and he's responsible for the death of her, I guess, fiance, and she has become a vigilante herself, killing off these bad perps. Some of them end up being on Oliver's list, but when Oliver catches wind of this, he starts, kind of spying on Helena, and then he kind of starts a relationship with her, and kind of develops feelings for her and wants to date her and wants to, tell her his real identity is Oliver Queen, and he wants to show her what he does and what he's learning to do, and that is to not kill. And he's trying to teach Helena that maybe the best way for her father to suffer isn't to die, but to send him away in jail forever. And this causes a rift between him and Helena, because at first Helena thought that maybe he was down to kill given his former reputation, but since he's trying to move on from just being a killer, they kind of have to drift ways, and Oliver comes to regret this later on by episode 17 of the season, which is honestly my least favorite episode of season 1, and possibly one of my least favorite episodes of Arrow ever, because not only does this episode feel like the most filler of this season, but it completely ruins another perfect way I think they could have incorporated a certain character into the season, and that is Officer McKenna. Now, Officer McKenna is Oliver's second main love interest of the season, and him and her have this past going back to college years together. And McKenna is a very sweet girl, and they have a romance that feels very genuine and unique. And personally, I would have liked to see the relationship end on a bit of a different note, but in this episode, episode 17, Huntress Returns, Helena comes back and essentially tries to blackmail Oliver at Club Verdant by, kidnapping Tommy, putting him in an arm bar and almost breaking his wrist, and then forcing Oliver to join forces with her to go hunt down her father and kill him. But in doing so, this gets Helena in some trouble, and she gets more pissed off with Oliver. And then Officer McKenna, who's Oliver's girlfriend, of course, is trying to help, Helena's father from being killed. And she ends up getting, like, pretty much wounded to the point where she had to move away from Starling City over to this Coast City place to live with her sister. And her and Oliver had this very amicable breakup, which is really just disheartening, because I think what I would have rather see happen with Officer McKenna is she should have survived up until the sacrifice. And honestly, this episode should have never happened. And the sacrifice episode we got is the final episode of the season at episode 23, should have been the next to last episode, and we got caught up to the events after that. But yeah, that aside, for this season, I think every episode, for the most part, outside of Burned and Huntress Returns, I genuinely like to some degree. I think the problem with Burn, which I think was episode 10, is that it's bona fide filler. And it's the episode where they bring Firefly in, and he's like this pyromaniac. And honestly, I can't tell you any of the side plots of this episode, because I don't think it does anything to advance the characters. This was the episode after the iconic holiday episode, which was episode 9. and that's one where Walter gets abducted and everything. So it's a tough act to follow, I guess, to bring back. Um, at that time, it was probably off for like almost a month or two before season 10 started bringing back the season, or episode 10 bringing back the season. But no, like I said, Burn is just a bona fide filler episode, and it's just like, why is it there? It's just there to cause more destruction and I guess more turmoil for Tommy's character. Other than that, you really didn't need this fucking episode. But other than those two episodes, like I said, I liked every episode, and I think there's certain episodes here and there that have way more action and choreography chops than the others. But for the most part, this season was just jam packed full of vigilante violence. This is the part of the show where Oliver's not quite the Green Arrow yet. He is pretty much the Hood. So there's certain episodes where he's kind of struggling with where he wants to take his persona. Does he want to keep killing people on this list? Does he want to kill the people that come up on his radar because of his friends' suggestions, or because these people end up doing things like Count Vertigo, for example? He's a villain that I haven't talked about. Count Vertigo was a more personal vendetta for him because Thea got vertigo, and he blames Count Vertigo for developing the drug. And we get more closure with that later on, where he has an opportunity to kill this guy for good after, even though he's had brain damage, and these doctors are using his brain, I guess, or I guess his blood to reformulate Vertigo. He can literally kill this guy and prevent Vertigo from ever getting made, but he's changed to the point where he wouldn't kill the guy. But if this was earlier on and he had the opportunity to do so, he probably would have. So that inclusion in the show is also really good. But tangent aside, I think the earlier episodes, surprisingly enough, when Oliver's doing a lot of the killing, don't really hit as much as the later episodes of this season. I think, like, maybe the first 4 episode stretch, they're all fine episodes. There's nothing too hateable or anything in it. Oliver's openly killing, but the show really hasn't found its footing yet. It's just Oliver, doing some like solo detective stuff, which is cool at times. And that kind of incorporates with him being like this solo guy that's struggling with some inner demons. Like we see him in the pilot episode, even when he's sleeping at home for the first time in years, and he's sleeping by the window when it's raining outside because he doesn't know how else to sleep, right? We see that he's like this damaged guy and he's working alone, he's jaded. But once he starts opening up to these characters and revealing to people his true identity, it becomes more enthralling, surprisingly enough, which ends up probably being the downfall of the show later in later seasons because of just the lack of care and the laziness that comes with that at a certain point. But yeah, like, the show gets better increasingly with time when it comes to how Oliver's portrayed, I feel. But going back to the idea that Oliver shares his identity with people. There's numerous people that he tells. Obviously, he tells Diggle. Obviously, he tells Felicity. But then again, I already brought up Helena Bertinelli. He tells Helena Bertinelli in a vote of confidence that maybe he can change her and make her part of his team, but it backfires, and it ends up backfiring pretty hard because it causes his girlfriend to get injured and she has to break up with him over it, which is saddening, and it's really unnecessary, and I would have gone a different direction. But he has to learn who he can really trust with that. And then also, I haven't mentioned this yet, but there's a certain episode in here that I think is also really good. I forget the name of it, but it's the episode where Malcolm Merlin gets shot by Deadshot, and Deadshot has this thing with his bullets that have like this Karar poison that poisons the blood of the bullets victims. This essentially kills Malcolm, and Tommy has to do a blood transfusion on him. Through that scene, Oliver reveals his true identity to Tommy, and Tommy knows the identity of Oliver for the remainder of the season, and that honestly drives a wedge even further into the relationship of Laurel has it by that point, which is, I think, a really much needed layer for their dynamic, and it makes it really interesting because Tommy knows Oliver's identity, but up until his dying breath, never gave it away to people, and I think that's very commendable. And through that, I think Oliver respects him by the end, and there's this promise made that he carries through the remainder of the show. And in a lot of ways, Tommy did create the Green Arrow that we get to know, in seasons 2 and onward in the show, which I really appreciated. But going back to regrets, right? What are the things that this season did wrong? There are three things that I think that this season did wrong in hindsight, and I think that if they adjusted certain things, it would have been way better as a show moving forward. First and foremost is the Helena Bertinelli thing with the Huntress. I think episodes 7 and 8 should have left off her character there, and Huntress could have come back at a later point, possibly as an uber villain, maybe with maybe like an actual 3 episode arc thing to bring her character back to make her geared up to be this big villain. I don't know how you would go about that, but Huntress's mishandle and the fact that I don't think she ever comes back in this show, from my knowledge or memory, I could be wrong on that, but she never comes back in a significant way. And we all know in the comics, Huntress is good friends with Black Canary. I think keeping her in the show as a scorned lover of Oliver would have been a great jumping off point for Laurel later on in the show to get taught and kind of brainwashed by Helena to hate Oliver. And maybe that's how Laurel learns Oliver's secret identity at first. And that's how Helena trains her to become the Black Canary. And then, Laurel has to learn that Oliver isn't who Helena says, and Helena really is a psycho bitch. And then maybe she works with Oliver and joins Team Arrow through that. Um, I would have much preferred that instead of just wasting her and making the most frustrating episode with McKenna in this season. But, that makes me to my second point, McKenna, Officer McKenna. I would have kept her as the romantic interest of Oliver. I would not have had Oliver had a fling in the second to last episode with Laurel just to drive Tommy's insecurity further. I would have had Laurel untouched by Oliver and had her with Tommy, and maybe they just break up and Laurel just sits in her apartment sad or something. That was unneeded. I would have kept McKenna as Oliver's love interest and had her be the person that died, as she could have been the officer on duty at the CNRI law firm, and she goes inside the building to save Laurel instead of Tommy, and she gets impaled by the spike. And this causes Oliver to feel like he failed his girlfriend. He failed the city because the earthquake machine went off or whatever. And he goes to Lian Yu, and that's what kicks off season 2. But like I said, I would have, if we got rid of episode 17, I would have had that the episode we got is episode 23, the sacrifice, be episode 22. Then episode 23 would have picked off with the aftermath of McKenna dying. Oliver's packing up, leaving for Lian Yu, and he's explaining to Laurel, saying like, I really did care about McKenna, but losing her just reminded me of losing Sarah and losing you, blah, 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 blah. And that can give Laurel maybe some breadcrumbs of how Oliver really feels about her without them full on hooking up. But maybe, just maybe, if you want to have them hook up or maybe kiss, that would be the episode to do so. Tommy can perhaps witness it. This can set Tommy off in a fit of rage, feeling like he's insecure. And since he learns that his father had been murdered by the Hood, who he knows is the Green, or I guess Oliver, this would drive him to go snoop through his dad's possessions, and he perhaps researches into Nandor Parbat, and we see Tommy get on a plane to go there to maybe meet with his father's teacher, and we can build on Tommy's character in season 2 moving forward, that he's going to take up the mantle as Dark Archer and his father's, I guess, dark legacy now that everybody knows that he was behind the undertaking because of Moira Queen spilling the beans. And then, of course, moving into Moira, I don't think it's a bad idea to put her into jail and have her character in jail for season 2. But I also think Moira was kind of wasted opportunity in this season because, as we see, she has a good arc and we learn a lot about her, and she's more of that morally gray character than the rest of the cast. But I do feel like they could have played on her information that she found out about her husband's death and the Queen's Gambit sinking a whole lot more. I felt like that part of the story in the season was kind of like a throwaway thing just to have an excuse for Walter to get abducted. And I think that's bullshit. But then again, I feel like that could have been built up a bit more, and that was wasted opportunity. But the last bit I want to say about this season is the Tommy Merlin aspect. Moving that into, um, we already talked about the Huntress and that the potential with Laurel later on with that. What I would have done differently overall is that, I wanted to see season one have more finality than open endedness. And I guess because it's a season one, they wanted to end on a cliffhanger, which I guess ending on Sacrifice's episode at the time was a cliffhanger because you're like, what the fuck did I just watch? I need to see what happens next. What are they gonna do? I feel like in hindsight that wasn't the best way to end the season, you know what I mean? I feel like in most other seasons there is some more finality with some breadcrumbs to lead you into the next season. This is the only season that doesn't have that. You know what I mean? There's no real finality. It's just the end happens, the undertaking happens, and then the fucking show ends, and then you have to come back to season two and find out the aftermath that way. No, like I just feel like there needed to be some breadcrumbs with some characters, better utilization of some characters, at least in terms of what they were given material wise. And then, like I said, with Officer McKenna, even like having her be the character to die makes more sense because they could have gone the angle like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3 with Tommy and have him become an uber villain later on, and especially given what we get in season 3 with like Thea, for example, who's I guess recontextualized to be, I guess, Oliver and Tommy's sister. That would have made an interesting story if Tommy and Thea were involved together. Then what ends up being, spoiler alert, Malcolm and Thea. And keeping Malcolm alive in this show is complete bullshit to me. I've never liked that idea. I think that it would have been interesting to move into season two to have Tommy have his own experiences and side quests, and we get like visions of him, or maybe he's reading on his father's memoirs and we get flashbacks of John Barrowman, who's the actor of Malcolm Merlin, going through his teachings and tutelage and what have you. I think that would have been a much interesting angle to build on for the future of the show. And like I said, because of these issues in season one, I can't really say that season one's a perfect season. Like there's a lot of missed opportunity here and ramifications that last through the rest of the show. And it's really upsetting. But in all honesty, I still really love this season. Like I said, it's pretty much for the most part well written. There's a lot of great episodes. Like I said, my favorite episodes are the Odyssey, Darkness at the Edge of Town, and maybe as an honorable mention, it would be like episode 5, which was, I forget what the episode title was, or maybe the last episode, The Sacrifice. And then, like I said, my easy two least favorites were Burned and Huntress Returns. Aside from those, like being the standout ones, all the remaining episodes, they were well written for the most part. Great action, and I think this is a great Green Arrow. I know a lot of people say that they have their problems with Oliver Queen in this show. He's not quite the Green Arrow yet, but I like the down and brooding, gritty Green Arrow we get in this show, and this is something that I really appreciate about these earlier seasons is that Oliver is this jaded, non-perfect character. He doesn't really have a sense of humor, and if he does, he is really only like that with his friends. Whether if he's eating out at a restaurant that him and Diggle like to eat at in the season one, for example, you see true Oliver still there, and I think people really undersell that about this show, sadly. But nonetheless, I'd probably give this season, in retrospect, back then I probably would have given this season maybe like a 9 out of 10. I think for this season, I'd probably today give it an 8 out of 10. It's a very good season of television. It's not quite my favorite season of Arrow, I feel. I'm hoping that the seasons that I remember liking more than this one hold up. We'll get to that point. And overall for the show. But yeah, I had a blast rewatching this season, to be honest. Like I said, it's been 10 years. This is kind of like a pulp show when you think about it. There's a lot of pulp drama, pulp action, but in that Neo sense, it's like a modern pulp show, and it's the closest thing I've been able to see outside of Marvel's Netflix's properties. So yeah, I mean, I'm having a blast. I'm currently in season 2 right now, so once I finish that season, I'll probably make a follow-up video for season 2. But yeah, let me know down in the comment section if you've seen Arrow season 1 before, either in the past or in more recent times. What's your thoughts on it? What are some things that you really enjoyed about this season? what things would you have done differently? What do you think possibly hampered the show moving forward? What do you think were good ideas that they should have kept in the show moving forward? I'm dying to know. Till next time, take care.